just quickly going to read you a little thing I wrote about John today in an op-ed for the Daily Blog. CIA torture whistleblower John Kiriakou was recruited from the high school that he taught Jared Leto at. In the decades to follow, he traveled the world, recruited other spies in turn, and oversaw operations that captured Al-Qaeda militants and sent them to Guantanamo Bay. Eventually, trained to keep secrets, there was one he could not live with. His government was torturing people. Eventually, he shared what he knew with his fellow countrymen, but tonight he will share it with New Zealand and the world. So John, please take it away. Tell us your story. Give us all the messages that you have to give.
Thank you so much for having me, for doing this, for giving me the opportunity, the soapbox. I'm happy to do it. And I'll apologize for the lighting. It's I have every light on in my room, and it's still, I fear, not light enough. Anyway, you're right. I was recruited into the CIA when I was in graduate school. I was teaching high school at the time at a private school in Washington, D.C. And as it turned out, my graduate school advisor was a CIA officer undercover as a graduate school advisor. And he was the one who recruited me into the agency. I had never really considered the CIA, but I was getting ready to graduate and I didn't have a job. I was getting married soon after graduation. I really needed the work. And the idea of seeing the world was exciting to me. And so I said, sure, I'll go through the process. So I did. I went through the process, got hired, started on the 1st of January, 1990, and started working as an analyst. So really, I was sitting in a cubicle, thinking the big thoughts, writing papers for the president, the vice president, the secretaries of state and defense, the national security advisor. And that was great. It was a lot of fun for a while. And then I got bored. Went overseas, also as an analyst, to the Middle East, learned to speak Arabic, and then went back to headquarters again in 1997. Again, I was bored. And so in 1998, I made a very unusual switch from analysis to counterterrorism operations, and went overseas as an operations officer, like actually trying to infiltrate terrorist groups and either disrupt future attacks or break up the group, and found that I had a knack for it. It was dangerous, certainly, but it was interesting, it was fun, it was important. And so I decided, well, maybe I found my place, my niche. I went back to CIA headquarters after serving overseas in 2000, and then September 11th hit in 2001. That changed everything at the CIA. As it turned out, the CIA, after 2001, returned to its roots. The CIA that I had come of age in was not the real CIA. The real CIA was one that requires great oversight, and one that is constantly pushing the bounds of morals and ethics and legality. But I was as angry as every other American on September 11th, and I volunteered certainly to go to Afghanistan and fight or do whatever was necessary. What I ended up doing was I was sent to Pakistan as the chief of CIA counterterrorism operations there. And it was in that job that in early 2002, I led a series of raids that resulted in the capture of Abu Zubaydah, whom the CIA believed at the time was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda, and many dozens, I'm not allowed to say the exact number, but many dozens of Al-Qaeda fighters at safe houses all over Pakistan. Well, I had occasion after capturing Abu Zubaydah to have a long conversation with him. In fact, I sat with him for 54 consecutive hours after his capture. He was very upset, as you could imagine. He cried a lot. He said that he would never know the touch of a woman. He would never know the joy of fatherhood. And I said, listen, you are not the victim here. There were 50,000 people in those towers. What did you think we were going to do? Did you think we weren't going to try to find you, to capture you, or to find or kill bin Laden? And he said that he never wanted to attack the United States on September 11th. He wanted to attack Israel. He said all he ever wanted to do was to kill Jews. And I said, listen, I am the nicest guy that you're going to meet in this experience. My colleagues are not as nice as I am. So if there's one thing that you do, it's that you should cooperate. And he said, you seem like a nice man, but you're the enemy, and I'll never cooperate. I said, suit yourself. Later that night, a CIA private jet flew in. 3 FBI agents and I loaded him onto the plane. He asked me to hold his hand the whole time, and I wished him the best of luck, and I never saw him again. Well, 2 months later, I returned to CIA headquarters, and on the strength of the Abu Zubaydah capture, I had been promoted, and I was named the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. And it was in that capacity that I had access to literally everything in the CIA, every operation, every sensitive compartment, everything. And it was in that position that I realized that we had initiated this torture program. Now, I was in the cafeteria one day, and a former colleague from the CIA's Counterterrorism Center approached me and said, hey, I'm glad I ran into you. Do you have any interest in being, and these were his words, certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques? I had never heard the term before. So I asked him what it meant. And he said very excitedly, we're going to start getting rough with these guys. And I said, well, what does that mean? And then he delineated these 10 torture techniques. And I said, well, that sounds like a torture program. I said, I think I have a moral problem with that. And I declined. Well, as it turned out, of the 14 people that they approached asking if they wanted to be trained in these torture techniques, I was the only one who said no. That was a source of great disappointment for me, but I kept my mouth shut. I left the CIA 2 years later and still kept my mouth shut. But then in late 2007, I couldn't live with the administration's lies anymore. It seemed like every time I turned on the television, President Bush was denying that there was a torture program. And the CIA's director at the time and directors after him, George Tenet, were all denying that there was a torture program. And I knew that that was a lie. I knew that they were lying to the American people. And I believe in transparency. I believe that the American people have a right to know what their country is doing in their name. And so I decided in December of 2007 that I was going to blow the whistle on this program. And I gave a nationally televised interview to ABC News in which I did exactly that. I said three things that have utterly changed the course of the rest of my life. I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official US government policy. It was not the result of a rogue, as President Bush had said. And I said that the torture program had been personally approved by the president himself. As you can imagine, within 24 hours, the FBI began investigating me. And this is where the story, in my view, becomes very sad. It becomes un-American. The FBI investigated me for a full year, from December 2007 to December 2008. And they decided at the end of that investigation that I had not committed a crime, that the interview was not a crime because the information was not inherently classified. And so they closed the investigation. 4 weeks later, Barack Obama was inaugurated as president of the United States. Barack Obama, the self-described most transparent president in history. And I should preface this by saying that I believed in the whole hope and change slogan of the Obama campaign. Not just that, I worked on the Obama campaign. I took my children to the inauguration so they could see this historic moment when for the first time in history, an African-American man had become president. I mean, this was an incredible moment for America. But what I did not know was that as soon as he became president, the CIA asked Barack Obama to secretly reopen the case against me, which he did. I had no idea that I was under investigation. I had no idea that the FBI was intercepting my phone calls and was reading my emails and had teams of surveillance on me. And so I went about my regular business. So what was my regular business? Well, believe it or not, John Kerry, who at the time was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, called me and invited me to join the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff as the chief investigator, investigating waste, fraud, abuse, and illegality in the State Department. And so I took that job, again, having no idea that I was under FBI investigation for what became 5 felony charges. The FBI investigated me for 3 more years. And finally, in January of 2012, I was charged with these 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage. Espionage is one of the gravest crimes with which an American can be charged, and frequently it carries with it the death penalty for telling the American people that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. Now, there's something that happened in the interim, and I had no idea the significance of it until this whole thing was over. One of the great things, the most wonderful things about working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is that you get to have lunch with foreign diplomats all the time. And, you know, you get together for lunch, you talk about the events of the day, whatever happens to be in the paper, you talk about diplomacy. I got a call one day, a totally normal and routine call from a Japanese diplomat who was the number 3 in the Japanese embassy in Washington. And he invited me to lunch. So we went to a small restaurant on Capitol Hill, and I remember the lunch as being delightful. I remember we talked about Israeli elections and Turkish elections and the Arab-Israeli peace process. And at the end of the lunch, he said to me, "So what's next for you?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually thinking of resigning from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I promised Senator Kerry that I would give him 2 years. It's been 2.5. And I think I'd like to go into business for myself. I have 5 kids. I need to start saving some money for college. I think I'd like to go into the private sector." And very excitedly, he said, "No, don't do that. If you give me information, I can give you money." And I said, "What's wrong with you? Do you have any idea how many times I've made that pitch in my career? Shame on you," I told him. I ended the lunch and I went directly to the office of the Senate Security Officer. And I said, I was just pitched by a foreign intelligence officer. And he said, "Oh, is it that damn Russian again?" And I said, No, it's a Japanese of all things." And he said, "Really, a Japanese? Okay." He said, "Well, sometimes they like to see what we're doing vis-a-vis trade." And then he asked me to write it up as a memo. He was going to send it to the FBI. I said, fine. So I sat there in his office and I wrote up the memo. He sent it to the FBI and then called me the next day and said 2 FBI agents were going to come and interview me. So they finally came to my office and said, "Okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to call him back and we want you to try to get him to tell you exactly what information he wants and how much money he's willing to pay for it." I said, "Okay, do you want me to wear a wire or something?" And they said, "No, we're going to be at the next table and we'll just listen to the conversation." I said, fine. So the morning of that lunch, they called me and said that something had come up. I should just go forward with the lunch and write them another memo. So I met with this guy a second time. And then they asked me to meet with him a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time, which I did because I'm a patriot. Well, I wrote up these memos after each lunch. And finally, in the fifth lunch, he said that he had been promoted. He had been transferred to his dream job, and he was going to be the number 2 in the Japanese embassy in Cairo. A year after that last lunch, I was arrested. And we received discovery from the Justice Department. Now, discovery is when the prosecution has to turn over to the defense literally everything that it's collected so that the defense can use that to defend itself. In this discovery, we found a series of memos. The first indicated that there never was any Japanese diplomat. He was an FBI agent undercover, and he was trying to get me to commit real espionage. And I asked my lead attorney, why would they do such a thing? And he said, because they have a shit case and they know it's a shit case. I hadn't committed espionage. I had blown the whistle, fair and square. I told the American people what they had a right to know. Well, we also received 3 memos between the CIA and the Justice Department. The CIA wrote to the Justice Department and said, charge him with espionage. The Justice Department wrote back and said, but he hasn't committed espionage. And the CIA wrote back and said, charge him anyway and make him defend himself. And that was the Obama administration. Now, the Espionage Act here in the United States was written in 1917 to combat German saboteurs during the First World War. Between 1917 and 2009, it was used to charge 3 Americans with espionage for talking to the press. Just under the Obama administration, 8 Americans were charged with espionage for speaking to the press. The Obama administration used the Espionage Act as an iron fist to stamp out dissent. Now, I was a guy who always colored within the lines. I was nobody special. There was nothing unusual about me in any way. I'm just a guy. I'm just a normal guy. But one of the things that so grossly disappointed me was that I was the only one who said something. You know, there were hundreds of people inside the CIA who knew about this torture program. Hundreds. We now know from the Senate torture report that people inside were objecting to it. They were writing cables back from the secret prison saying, this is awful, this is disgusting. A couple of them curtailed their assignments, which means they asked to return to headquarters. It's a career-ending move, but not a single one of them said something publicly. Even worse than that, not a single one of them ever said anything to the Senate or House Intelligence Committee, the oversight committees. I was the only one who did. That was a source of great disappointment for me. Well, in the end, Kim and I were talking about this off camera a few minutes ago. In the end, I had to defend myself against these 5 felony charges. I was facing 45 years in prison. And over the course of 10 months, our negotiations had brought the Justice Department down to 10 years. They wanted me to do 10 years in a federal penitentiary. This was what they called their best and final offer. And I turned it down. And I said 2 things. I said, first of all, I haven't done anything wrong. And because I haven't done anything wrong, I'm not doing 10 minutes, let alone 10 years in prison. Secondly, I'm a very long time former CIA officer. And in my 15 years in the CIA, I witnessed hideous shit, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And I'm going to have to testify in my own defense. And I might accidentally say something about these horrible crimes that I've witnessed my colleagues perpetrate over the years. And it might slip out in the course of my, my testimony. And so the CIA came back and said, all right, do 2.5 years. You'll end up serving under 2. I actually turned that down. And then one of my 11 attorneys, the one who I liked and respected the most, pulled me aside and said, you just don't get it. This isn't about innocence or guilt. This is about cutting your losses. This is about inflicting the least amount of pain on yourself and your family. It doesn't matter whether you did it or didn't do it. The federal government wins 98.2% of its cases, according to ProPublica. And he said, if you were my brother, I would beg you to take this deal. So I'm begging you, take the deal. He said, this can be a blip in your life, or it can be the defining event of your life. You can be home early enough that your children won't even remember you were gone, or you can get out when your children are in college. And so I took the deal. It becomes an economic decision. With that said, I would do the whole damn thing over again. Somebody had to say something. Transparency is real. It's important. A democracy can't function without transparency. And again, the American people have a right to know what their government is doing in their name. And so I'm glad that I said something. I'm glad that I said something. I'm glad that I have continued to say something. It's cost me my marriage. My wife left 3 months ago. She said it's just too much work to be Mrs. John Kiriakou. To tell you the truth, I don't blame her. But I had to do the right thing. And this was the price that we all have to pay. It was all worth it. Thanks for listening.